Marcus drove home under the fading light of dusk, his thoughts already heavy with memories of a lifetime marked by cautious hope and bitter disappointment, when suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror shattered the fragile calm of the evening, and he felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach as he pulled over to the side of the road. Every instinct alerting him that this moment was not just a routine stop but a reminder of every encounter with law enforcement that had scarred his soul. As he sat in the driver's seat, heart pounding against his ribs, he recalled the days of overt segregation and subtle modern profiling alike, the countless times his presence had been questioned, his character doubted solely because of the color of his skin, and in that suspended moment, the world narrowed to the hum of the engine and the heavy silence of his thoughts. While the officer approached the vehicle with a posture that betrayed both determination and the weight of a job done too often without reflection, and as Marcus rolled down his window, his eyes meeting the officer's stern gaze, he was flooded with memories of his youth, a time when racial injustice was overt and unyielding, when economic disparity had forced his community into the shadows of a society that thrived on exclusion, and when every interaction with authority felt like a negotiation for his very life. Yet now, in this modern era, the veneer of progress masked a reality where profiling was still rampant, and as the officer spoke in clipped, rehearsed phrases, Marcus listened to his words, each one a reminder that for some, doing their job was simply a matter of following orders without understanding the human cost. While Marcus's internal monologue roared with silent indignation and sorrow, his mind replaying past encounters where trust had been betrayed and dignity trampled. And as he reached for his documents with trembling hands, he couldn't help but wonder if the officer ever saw him as anything other than a statistic, a problem to be managed. And in that fraught silence, a shocking realization surged through him, a memory of a long-forgotten conversation with his mother on a hot summer night when she whispered about a secret in their family history, a secret that revealed their lineage had once been intertwined with powerful figures in the civil rights movement, a truth buried under decades of systemic oppression and deliberate erasure, which made him question not only the motives of those enforcing the law but also the very fabric of the system that had been designed to control him. And as the officer's eyes flickered briefly with a hint of something unspoken, a momentary pause in the barrage of routine, Marcus felt a bitter hope that perhaps this encounter could be different. That maybe beneath the hardened exterior of duty lay a sliver of recognition for the injustice they both had witnessed in different ways. Yet that hope was quickly smothered by the unyielding protocol of the stop, as the officer continued, his voice devoid of empathy, instructing Marcus to step out of the car, and in that excruciatingly slow, tense moment, Marcus stepped out, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of his lifelong struggle, as the chill of the evening mingled with the heat of his anger and despair, and as he stood there, exposed and vulnerable under the stark glare of streetlights, he could almost see the ghosts of his past, faces of friends lost to violent encounters with law enforcement, voices of his ancestors protesting against the tyranny of discrimination, and in that collision of past and present, the officer finally reached for his radio, his face set in an expression that Marcus could read like a predetermined script, and in that moment, as a silent witness to the cruelty of the system that refused to evolve despite the promises of modernity, Marcus's inner voice roared with the painful truth that survival had always been a balancing act on a knife's edge. And as the interaction reached its peak, with Marcus's eyes burning with a mix of defiance and resigned sorrow, and the officer's tone a hollow echo of duty and learned prejudice, the world around them blurred into a vortex of flashing lights and unspoken accusations, leaving Marcus suspended in time, questioning whether true change was ever possible in a society that measured a man's worth by the color of his skin. As the encounter drew to an end with the officer's curt nod and the sound of the car door closing, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts, his heart heavy with the cost of every life chipped away by injustice, and as he walked back to his car under the cold gaze of the night, his mind filled with memories, revelations, and the haunting awareness that his survival came at a price that, no matter how much hope he clung to, seemed destined to be paid in the currency of endless struggle and unfulfilled promises. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his breath shallow, the weight of the encounter pressing down on his chest like a stone as he stared straight ahead, willing his heartbeat to slow. But the echoes of the officer's voice still rang in his ears, the sterile commands, the unfeeling tone, the way he had been scrutinized like a threat, not a man, and he wanted to tell himself it was over, that he could drive home and pretend this was just another ordinary night, but he knew better, knew that this moment would sink into his bones just like every other time, another scar added to a lifetime of wounds that never had the chance to fully heal. And as he finally pulled away from the curb, his hands trembling against the wheel, he thought of his father, of the long lectures and weary warnings given to him as a boy, lessons no child should have to learn, how to keep his voice calm, his hands visible, his movements slow, how to shrink himself, make himself non-threatening, how to walk away with his life intact even if it meant swallowing his pride. And he hated that those lessons were still relevant, that they had not been relics of an uglier past but a manual for survival in a present that refused to change. And the thought filled him with a rage so sharp it almost took his breath away, because what kind of world demanded this? What kind of system forced generation after generation of black men to live in this constant state of alert, of fear, of knowing that one wrong move, one misinterpreted glance, could mean the difference between going home and becoming a name on the evening news? And he blinked hard, shaking his head, as the road stretched ahead, his mind spiraling back to a time when he had been naive enough to believe things might be different for him, back to when he had first left home, young and hopeful, believing in hard work, in education, in proving himself, in showing the world that he was just as capable, just as worthy, just as human. But life had a way of grinding that hope into dust, of reminding him at every turn that no amount of achievement, no degree, no promotion, no carefully chosen words could shield him from the reality of his skin. And he thought of his mother, of how she had cried when he got his first car, not out of pride but out of fear, how she had made him promise to always call her when he got home safely, and he had rolled his eyes back then, not fully understanding what it meant to be truly afraid for someone you loved. But now, all these years later, he understood, and he hated that he did, hated that he would one day have to give his own son the same speech, that nothing had changed, not really. And as the neon lights of a gas station flickered ahead, he pulled in, needing a moment to breathe, to gather himself. But as he stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting his skin, he caught sight of an elderly black man sitting on a bench near the entrance, his face lined with the weight of too many years, and their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition, an understanding, a shared history of battles fought in silence. And Marcus hesitated, then walked over, something inside him compelling him to speak, to ask. And the old man looked up, his gaze steady, tired but sharp, and before Marcus could say anything, the man sighed and said, "They got you tonight, didn't they?" And Marcus felt something in his chest tighten, a lump rising in his throat as he nodded, and the man shook his head, a sad smile playing at his lips, and said, "They got me too, back when I was your age, and my father before me, and his before him." And Marcus swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists at his sides, because he knew it was true, knew that this wasn't just his fight, that it had been going on for longer than he had been alive. And the old man leaned back, exhaling slowly, and said, "You ever wonder how many times we've lived this same night? How many of us been pulled over on a quiet road, wondering if it'll be the last time?" And Marcus didn't answer because he didn't need to, because the question hung heavy in the air between them, a truth too painful to say out loud. And after a long moment, the old man sighed again and said, "But you're still here." And there was something in the way he said it, something that felt both like a consolation and a curse. And Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that survival itself was an act of defiance, that every breath he took, every mile he drove, every time he made it home was a small victory against a system that wanted him broken. And as he turned to leave, the old man called after him, "Don't let it take your soul, son." And Marcus paused, those words settling deep inside him, because he knew that was the real danger, not just the fear, not just the exhaustion, but the slow erosion of hope, of self, of the belief that things could ever be different. And as he got back into his car, gripping the wheel with new determination, he took a deep breath, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror, at the man he had become, the man the world tried to diminish, but he would not let them, not tonight, not ever. And as he pulled back onto the road, the city lights blinking in the distance, he drove forward, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing one thing for certain: he would not be erased. As Marcus drove down the dimly lit road, his mind raced, thoughts colliding in a chaotic storm of memory and fear and something else, something heavier, something closer to rage but more like exhaustion, the kind that settled into the bones and made even breathing feel like work, because no matter how many times he survived nights like this, no matter how many times he followed all the rules, kept his hands visible, kept his voice steady, called officers, "Sir," even when they didn't deserve it, he always left feeling like something had been taken from him, something he couldn't quite name, but felt all the same. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what they wanted. For men like him to carry the weight of these moments long after they had ended, to drive home in silence with their knuckles aching from gripping the wheel too tightly, to wake up the next morning pretending they weren't still haunted. And Marcus knew, he should be used to it by now, had told himself enough times, that this was just how the world worked. But tonight, something about it felt different. Something about the old man's words clung to him like smoke. "Don't let it take your soul, son." And he kept hearing them over and over, like an echo in his ribs. And maybe it was because he was older now. Maybe it was because he had seen too much. Maybe it was because he had a son of his own. But the weight of it all felt unbearable tonight. Like if he didn't let it out, it would crush him. So instead of going home, instead of pulling into his driveway and sitting in the car until his hands stopped shaking, he found himself driving past the quiet neighborhoods, past the gas stations and fast food places and boarded-up shops, until he reached a part of town he hadn't been to in years, a place where memories lay buried beneath cracked pavement and flickering streetlights, a place where the ghosts of his past still lingered in the air. And he pulled into the parking lot of an old diner, the neon sign buzzing weakly, the kind of place that had always been there, the kind of place that never changed no matter how much the world around it did. And as he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly, the scent of coffee and grease wrapping around him, he saw her, sitting in the same booth she always had, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, her sharp eyes scanning the room, like she was always expecting something. And when she saw him, her expression barely shifted, just the smallest flicker of recognition before she gestured for him to sit, and he did, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat across from her. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, just the hum of the diner around them, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of conversation, and then she said, "It happened again, didn't it?" And Marcus exhaled slowly, nodding, because of course she knew, of course she could see it in his face, the same way she always could, because she had lived through it too, had spent her whole life navigating this same world, fighting these same battles, and she had taught him everything he knew about how to survive it, had raised him with her sharp tongue and steady hands, had sat him down when he was 12 years old and told him what to do if he ever got stopped, told him that it didn't matter how smart he was, didn't matter how kind, didn't matter that he had dreams bigger than this city. All that mattered in that moment was getting out alive, and he had hated hearing it then, had wanted to believe she was wrong, had wanted to believe that the world wasn't as cruel as she made it out to be, but he had learned the hard way, and now, as he sat across from her, he saw the exhaustion in her face too, the lines etched into her skin like a map of every injustice she had ever endured, and she sighed, shaking her head, stirring her coffee with slow, deliberate movements, and said, "You gotta let it eat you up, or you gotta do something." And Marcus blinked at her, his jaw tightening, because what was there to do? What could he do that hadn't already been done, that hadn't already been tried? And she must have seen the doubt in his face, because she scoffed, setting her spoon down with a clatter, fixing him with a look so sharp it cut through the fog in his mind, and she said, "Boy, Don't sit there looking like you ain't got no fight left in you. I didn't raise you to be a coward. And Marcus felt something hot rise in his chest. Something close to shame, but not quite, because she was right. She was always right. And he thought of his son, of what he would tell him one day, of the kind of world he wanted him to grow up in. And he realized he couldn't just keep living like this, couldn't keep swallowing it down, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending it didn't change him. And he didn't know what it meant yet, didn't know what he would do. But he knew he couldn't keep doing nothing, and as he sat there, staring at the woman who had given him everything, he felt something shift inside him, something small but undeniable, and he nodded, just once, and she saw it, saw the decision settling in his bones, and she smirked, leaning back, sipping her coffee like she had all the time in the world, and she said, "That's my boy." And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something like hope. Marcus sat in silence, his mother's words settling in his chest like a slow-burning fire, flickering, growing, consuming the spaces where fear and exhaustion had taken root for too long. And as he looked at her, at the woman who had raised him to be strong even when the world tried to break him, he thought of all the moments that had led him here, every traffic stop, every wary glance in a store, every time he had to lower his voice, soften his stance, shrink himself down just to make other people feel safe. And he thought of his son, sleeping soundly at home, still too young to understand the weight of the world waiting for him, still too innocent to know the lessons he would one day have to learn. And the thought of it made Marcus's stomach twist, because how many times had history repeated itself? How many fathers had sat where he sat? How many sons had grown up believing they could outrun the shadow of what this country had made them, only to realize too late that it was always right behind them, waiting for the moment they let their guard down. And he felt a sharp, bitter anger rise in his throat, because he was tired of swallowing it down, tired of pretending it didn't hurt, tired of acting like survival was enough, because it wasn't, not anymore, not when every day felt like another compromise, another sacrifice, another piece of himself lost to a system that was never built for him. And he clenched his fists beneath the table, knuckles turning white. And his mother watched him, her gaze steady, unwavering, like she knew exactly what he was thinking, because she had been there too, had felt that same rage, that same weariness, and she sighed, setting her coffee down, and said, "It's not just about you, baby, it never was." And Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face, because he knew she was right, she was always right. And that was the hardest part, knowing that his fight wasn't just his, that every choice he made, every risk he took, wasn't just for him, but for every person who had come before him and every person who would come after. And for a long moment, he didn't say anything, just stared down at the cracked vinyl of the booth, listening to the low hum of the diner, the clatter of plates, the distant sound of a jukebox playing some old song that felt like it had always been playing. And then he looked up at his mother, at the lines in her face, at the tired wisdom in her eyes, and he said, "I don't know how to change it." And she studied him for a moment, then smiled, a small, knowing thing, and said, "You don't have to know, you just have to start." And Marcus swallowed hard, nodding slowly, because maybe she was right, maybe waiting for the perfect plan, the perfect moment, was just another excuse to do nothing. Maybe change didn't come in grand gestures, maybe it came in small defiant acts, in refusing to be silent, in refusing to look away, in telling the truth even when people didn't want to hear it. And he thought of his son again, thought of the world he wanted to build for him, thought of the future he refused to let slip away, and something inside him hardened, solidified, and he met his mother's gaze and said, "I'm tired of being afraid." And she smiled wider, nodding, because she had been waiting for him to say it, waiting for him to see what she had seen in him all along. And she reached across the table, squeezing his hand, and said, "Good." And just like that, something shifted, something cracked open, and Marcus didn't know what came next, didn't know where this road would lead him, but he knew he wasn't turning back, not this time. And as he left the diner, stepping into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of generations pressing against his shoulders, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel crushed by it. He felt steady, he felt ready, he felt free. Marcus stepped into the night, the air thick with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen, the neon lights from the diner casting a faint glow on the cracked pavement beneath his feet, and for a moment, he just stood there, breathing, feeling the weight of everything that had come before, every moment of hesitation, every choice that had been made for him, every roadblock, every warning, every time he had swallowed his words, because saying them out loud might cost him more than he could afford to lose. But now, standing here, something inside him had shifted, something irreversible, and he could still hear his mother's voice in his head, calm but firm, telling him it wasn't just about him, that it never was, and the truth of it settled deep into his bones because she was right, she was always right, and he wasn't just carrying his own burdens, he was carrying his father's, his grandfather's, his ancestors', the weight of every man who had stood where he stood and felt the same thing. The same frustration, the same exhaustion, the same unrelenting rage at a world that saw them as less, a world that never once let them forget they had to fight twice as hard just to stand in the same place as anyone else, and he clenched his fists, exhaling sharply, knowing there was no turning back now, knowing that whatever came next, he had already made his choice, and he started walking, the city humming around him, the distant wail of sirens, the muffled laughter from a bar down the street, the sound of his own footsteps steady against the sidewalk, and he thought about his son, about the world he was growing up in, about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same, and it made his chest ache because he wanted more for him, wanted better, wanted a future where he didn't have to have these same conversations, where he didn't have to carry the same fear, where he didn't have to wonder if he would make it home if he took the wrong turn or reached for his wallet too fast or looked a cop in the eyes for a second too long, and as he reached his car, he hesitated, gripping the handle, his reflection staring back at him in the window, tired eyes, clenched jaw, a man at a crossroads, and he thought about driving home, about going inside, and kissing his wife, and watching his son sleep and pretending, just for a little while, that the world outside their door wasn't waiting to take something from him. But he couldn't, not anymore, not after tonight, not after everything, because silence was a choice, complicity was a choice, and he had spent his whole life trying to play by the rules, trying to stay in line, trying to make himself small enough to fit inside the spaces the world allowed him, but no more, not now, and without thinking, he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving before his mind could catch up, dialing a number he had been avoiding for weeks, and when the voice on the other end picked up, surprised, cautious, he took a deep breath and said, "I'm in." And just like that, the ground beneath him felt different, the air around him sharper, charged with something he couldn't quite name, because he had stepped over a line, crossed into something bigger than himself, and there was no going back, not now, not ever. And as he got into his car and pulled away from the curb, his heart pounded, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with something he hadn't felt in a long time, purpose, clarity, fire, and he didn't know where this road would take him, didn't know what sacrifices it would demand, but he knew one thing for certain, he was ready, finally, truly ready, and whatever came next, he would face it, not just for himself, but for his son, for his mother, for every man who had stood in his shoes and dreamed of a different ending, and as the city lights blurred past him, as the rain finally began to fall, he gripped the wheel tighter, jaw set, eyes steady. Because this time, he wasn't running, this time, he was moving forward, this time, he was going to make sure they heard him. As Marcus drove through the dimly lit streets, the rain drumming against the windshield, his hands tightened on the wheel, his thoughts racing as fast as his heart, because he knew there was no undoing this choice, no turning back, no more blending into the background, no more swallowing words that burned his throat, no more keeping his head down and hoping to make it through the night without incident, because he had already seen too much, felt too much, and the weight of it all had become unbearable, the way every interaction with law enforcement came with an unspoken threat, the way his father used to tell him to keep his hands visible at all times, to speak in a calm, even voice, to never, ever make sudden movements, the way those lessons had been passed down like a family heirloom, not because they wanted to but because they had to, because survival depended on it, and he could still hear his father's voice in his ear, reminding him that it only took one wrong moment, one misunderstanding, one officer having a bad day for everything to be over, and Marcus had lived his whole life with that awareness, had carried it with him into every grocery store, every job interview, every walk through a predominantly white neighborhood, and now, sitting behind the wheel of his car, his knuckles white against the leather, he felt it again, that familiar pressure, that ever-present tightness in his chest. But this time, it was different, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to suppress it, wasn't trying to outrun it, wasn't trying to convince himself that things would get better if he just kept his head down and played by the rules. Because he had played by the rules, he had done everything right, and still, it had never been enough. Still he had been pulled over, still he had been questioned, still he had been made to feel like a criminal in his own skin, and tonight, after everything, after the years of silence, of restraint, of walking that impossible tightrope, he was done, and as he pulled up to the address he had been given, a nondescript brick building on the outskirts of the city, the streetlights flickering, the rain now a steady downpour, he felt a new kind of energy thrumming through his veins, something between fear and exhilaration, because he knew this was it, the moment where everything shifted, where he stopped being a man just trying to make it through the day and became something else, something more, and as he stepped out of the car, the cold rain soaking through his clothes instantly, he didn't hesitate, didn't look back, just walked to the door, knocked twice, waited, and when it opened, when he stepped inside and saw the faces of people who had been fighting this fight for longer than he had, people who had scars to prove it, people who looked at him not with suspicion, but with recognition, with understanding, he knew he was where he was meant to be, knew that whatever came next, he wasn't alone. And as he listened to them speak, as he heard their stories, their plans, their determination, he felt something inside him settle, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, wasn't just existing, he was fighting back, and as the night stretched on, as they spoke in hushed voices about protests and policy changes and the risks they were all taking, Marcus felt something shift inside him, something irreversible, because he had spent too long letting fear dictate his life. Too long letting the system tell him who he was allowed to be, and now he was ready to push back, to raise his voice, to be seen, to be heard, to stand up for something bigger than himself. And as he walked back to his car in the early hours of the morning, the rain finally easing, the city still and quiet around him, he knew there was no going back, knew that whatever came next, whatever sacrifices had to be made, he would face them head on, because this was bigger than him, bigger than his fears, bigger than the years he had spent trying to play it safe. And as he pulled away from the curb, as the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope, not the naive hope of a man waiting for change to come, but the sharp, electric hope of a man ready to make it happen. And as he drove home, as the city came to life around him, he made a silent promise to himself, to his son, to his father, to every man who had come before him. He would not stop, he would not back down, he would not let them win, because he had spent his whole life being afraid, and he was done being afraid. Marcus barely slept that night, his mind a storm of memories, fears, and something else, determination, the kind that no longer allowed him the luxury of passivity, the kind that made it impossible to return to the life he had lived before, the kind that burned away the last remnants of the man who had once believed that if he just followed the rules, if he just did everything right, he would be safe, because he knew now, without a doubt, that safety had never been his to have, not in this world, not in this country, not in this skin. And as the first light of morning streamed through his blinds, he sat at his kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee untouched in front of him, staring at his hands, remembering the way his father's hands had looked when he was a boy, strong and calloused, marked by years of labor, by nights spent fixing cars and days spent holding a sign demanding justice, by the kind of quiet strength that had been passed down through generations. And he thought about what his father would say to him now, if he would be proud, if he would tell him to be careful, if he would remind him that this fight was older than either of them, older than their whole bloodline, if he would say what he always said, that change came slow, that the world wasn't built to move for men like them. But that didn't mean they stopped pushing, didn't mean they stopped trying. And Marcus felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest as he finally took a sip of the bitter coffee. As he picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages from the night before, from the people he had met in that dimly lit room, from the organizers who had looked at him like they had been waiting for him, like they had seen 100 men like him before, men who had spent years on the sidelines before something snapped, before something in him refused to stay silent any longer. And he knew what he had to do. Knew that this wasn't just about last night, wasn't just about one traffic stop, one moment, one injustice. It was about all of them, about every look, every accusation, every time he had been followed in a store, every time he had been told to be grateful for what he had even as he watched others get more for doing less, about every headline, every name, every funeral, about the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. And he didn't hesitate as he typed out his response. As he told them he was in, that he was ready, that he wasn't just angry. He was done waiting, done hoping, done believing that change would come without a fight. And when his phone buzzed with responses, with words of welcome, of solidarity, of plans already in motion, he felt something inside him shift again, a sense of purpose settling into his bones, because this wasn't just about him. It never had been. And as the days stretched on, as he made calls, as he met with others, as he listened, as he learned, he realized just how much he had never been taught, just how much history had been erased, just how many stories had been buried beneath the version of America they wanted him to believe in. And with every revelation, with every new truth, his resolve hardened, because he knew now that the system was not broken. It had been built this way, designed to function exactly as it did. And if that was the case, if the foundation itself was rotten, then there was only one answer: tear it down, start over, build something better. And as night fell again, as he stood outside a courthouse where people gathered, where signs were held high, where voices rose in chants that echoed through the streets, he felt something powerful, something undeniable, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just witnessing history, he was part of it. And when the police showed up, when the lights flashed, when the shouts grew louder, when the air vibrated with the kind of tension he had felt his entire life, he did not run. He did not flinch. He did not shrink into the shadows. He stood tall, his heart pounding, his fists clenched, his breath steady, because this time he would not be silent. This time he would not back down. This time he was ready to be heard. Marcus felt the weight of the night settle into his bones as the shouts grew louder, as the air thickened with the electric charge of something inevitable, as the flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across determined faces, fists raised, voices breaking through the night, demanding justice, demanding change, demanding to be seen, to be heard, to no longer be ignored. And he stood among them, his pulse steady, his mind clear, because there was no turning back now. No more hiding, no more hoping in silence, no more waiting for the world to decide when it was ready to do what was right, because history had shown him, had shown all of them, that change never came without struggle, that power never relinquished itself willingly, that the world only moved forward when people pushed it, when they bled for it, when they stood in the face of fear and refused to bow. And he saw the officers lining up, their hands resting on weapons, their faces unreadable behind riot shields, their bodies still but coiled with tension, waiting for an excuse, waiting for a moment, waiting for a command. And Marcus knew how this would go, had seen it too many times, had lived through it too many times, knew that no matter how peaceful, no matter how justified, no matter how necessary this fight was, the system would push back, would find a way to paint them as the villains, would justify whatever came next. And he thought of his father. of the marches he had been a part of the beatings, the jail cells, the nights spent wondering if the struggle would ever be worth it, if the world would ever change, and he thought of every name, every story, every life cut short by the very hands that claimed to serve and protect, and he knew that fear could no longer be a part of his decision-making, that fear was the weapon they wielded against them, the thing that kept them docile, that kept them quiet, that kept them in line. And as an officer stepped forward, his voice sharp, commanding them to disperse, to go home, to submit, Marcus took a breath, deep and slow, let the anger settle into something sharper, something more controlled, and he raised his voice, not in defiance, not in rage, but in something stronger, something undeniable, the truth, because the truth had always been the greatest weapon they had, the thing that, no matter how much they tried, could never truly be silenced. And as he spoke, as he declared what they all knew, as he named the injustice, as he refused to let it be twisted into anything less than what it was, he saw something shift in the faces of the people around him, in the way their voices grew, in the way they stood stronger, taller, together, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw the fear in the eyes of the men in uniform, not the fear of violence, not the fear of chaos, but the fear of something deeper, the fear of a system losing control, the fear of a truth too loud to be ignored. And he knew then, without a doubt, that no matter what happened next, no matter what they did to try and stop them, the fight would not end here, the movement would not die, because they had already won in the only way that mattered. They had made the world listen, and once you force the world to hear you, once you rip the veil away from its eyes, once you make it see what it tried to pretend wasn't there, you cannot be unseen, you cannot be unheard, you cannot be erased. And as the night stretched on, as the tension snapped, as the storm came crashing down around them, Marcus did not flinch, did not run, did not close his eyes, because he had already decided that no matter what came next, he would meet it head-on, unbroken, unbowed, because that was what survival had always meant, and if he had to fight for every breath, for every step, for every inch of justice, then so be it, because the weight of history was heavy, but he was no longer carrying it alone. The chaos swirled around Marcus like a storm, voices clashing with the piercing wail of sirens, fists raised against the glare of floodlights, the air thick with smoke, tear gas, fear, determination, and something deeper, something unbreakable, something that had been forged over centuries of pain, injustice, and resistance. And as he stood there, feet planted firmly on the cracked pavement, he felt the weight of history press into him, felt the echoes of those who had stood before him, in different times, on different streets, against different men in uniform, but always against the same forces, the same hands of oppression, the same cold, calculating system designed to strip them of their dignity, their breath, their existence. And he thought of his father, of the stories he used to tell in hushed tones late at night, of the time he had been pulled from his car, slammed against the hood, accused of something he had not done, of the way he had learned, through bruises and blood, that his word, his innocence, his humanity meant nothing to those who saw only his skin. And Marcus thought of how, decades later, he was standing in the same place, facing the same hatred, the same violence, the same unspoken rule that said men like him were guilty before they even opened their mouths, before they even existed, and for a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush him, to pull him under, to make him believe that nothing ever truly changed, that no matter how loud they screamed, no matter how hard they fought, the world would keep spinning on the same axis of injustice, that the system was too deeply rooted, too well-oiled, too powerful to ever fall. But then he looked around, at the people beside him, at the young girl clutching a cardboard sign with shaking hands, at the elderly man with lines of grief etched into his face, but fire still burning in his eyes, at the mother gripping the hand of her son, as if to shield him from the world that had already marked him as a threat, at the countless faces, black, white, brown, all standing together, refusing to be silenced, refusing to disappear. And he realized that this was not the same fight his father had fought alone. This was something bigger, something stronger, something that could not be erased. And just as that thought settled into him, he heard the first gunshot, a crack that split the night, a sound that sent bodies scattering, that sent hearts racing, that sent time slowing to a crawl. As he turned his head, searching, dreading, knowing what came next, because he had seen it too many times before, the way violence always came when the truth became too loud, when the system felt its grip slipping, when fear was all it had left to control them, and in the haze of panic and screaming, he saw a body fall, saw the way the crowd surged back, saw the horror spread like wildfire, saw the uniformed men moving forward, batons raised, shields locked, saw the gas canisters hit the pavement with a metallic clang before plumes of white smoke billowed out, stinging eyes, burning throats, choking the air, and Marcus knew then that this was the moment where everything tilted, where the night would be written into history as either a step forward or another bloody reminder of how far they still had to go, and his pulse pounded as he moved, as he reached out, as he grabbed the girl who had fallen to her knees, coughing, helped her up, shielded her as more gunshots cracked through the air, and his mind flashed with images of his mother clutching his arm when he was a boy, whispering prayers whenever he left the house, of the fear in her eyes every time she heard a siren, of the way his father had once looked at him and said, "Be careful, son, because the world won't be careful with you." And now here he was, in the middle of it all, the weight of every generation before him pressing against his ribs. But he did not run, did not falter, did not let the fear take root, because if he did, then they had already won, and he refused to be another name on a list, another lost cause, another lesson in what happened when black men dared to demand humanity. And so he stood, even as the gas burned his lungs, even as the line of officers advanced, even as the night cracked open with chaos, because he knew that this was not just about him, not just about tonight, not just about this one fight, this one battle, but about something greater, something unstoppable, something that would outlive even the bullets and the batons and the fear, because for every injustice there was resistance, for every act of oppression there was defiance, and for every life stolen there were those left behind who refused to forget, who refused to stop, who refused to let the world turn its back. And so he raised his hands, not in surrender, but in defiance, in power, in unyielding truth. And he shouted, voice hoarse, lungs burning, but still strong, still unbroken, still heard, and the others joined him, their voices rising together, drowning out the sirens, the shouts, the terror, because no matter what happened next, no matter how the night ended, no matter what the headlines would say tomorrow, they had already won the only battle that mattered. They had refused to be silent, they had refused to disappear, they had forced the world to see them, and once the truth was seen, once the voices of the unheard became too loud to ignore, there was no going back, no stopping, no erasing what had already begun. And so Marcus stood, with history at his back and the future before him, unafraid, unshaken, because he knew that this was not the end, that this was only the beginning, and no matter what came next, they would not stop.